behind the perfectly polished public image in designer gowns, Princess Catherine carries a secret that would make your heart skip a beat. Every few weeks, when the royal cameras aren't rolling and the palace gates close to the public, she slips away to places that most people would never expect royalty to visit. These aren't glamorous charity galas or state dinners. They're quiet corners of Britain, where real people face real struggles, and where Catherine's true character shines brightest when nobody's watching. What you're about to discover will completely change how you see the future Queen of England. This isn't just another royal story about duty and protocol. This is about a mother, a woman, and a future monarch who has chosen to use her privilege in ways that the palace doesn't always publicize. The places she visits, the people she meets, and the conversations she has reveal a side of royalty that fairy tales never taught us existed. The morning mist hung low over the quiet streets of East London as an unmarked black car pulled up outside a modest brick building. No fanfare, no photographers, no red carpet, just Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepping out wearing jeans, trainers, and a simple jacket that any mother might wear for the school run. The only hint of her royal status was the discreet security detail that melted into the background, trained to be invisible, while she did what she came here to do. The building didn't look like much from the outside: weathered brick walls, painted window frames that had seen better days, and a small sign that simply read Safe Haven Children's Center. But inside these walls, something magical happened every Tuesday morning, and Catherine had been part of it for longer than most people realized. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors and was immediately enveloped by the sounds of childhood laughter, chatter, the occasional cry of a baby, and the soft voice of a volunteer reading a story. The scent of freshly baked biscuits, mixed with the smell of Play-Doh and paint, creating an atmosphere that was distinctly warm and welcoming. "Catherine," called out Sarah Mitchell, the center's director, a woman whose salt and pepper hair and gentle smile spoke of 30 years spent caring for London's most vulnerable children. "The children have been asking about you all week." Catherine had been visiting Safe Haven every few weeks for the past 3 years, always quietly, always without announcement. She'd started coming after reading about the centre in a local newspaper, a small article buried on page 7 about a community organisation struggling to stay afloat while serving families in crisis. Most people in her position might have written a cheque or asked an aide to make a donation. Catherine had done something different. She'd called Sarah directly, introduced herself simply as Kate, and asked if she could visit. Sarah later admitted she'd thought it was a prank call until Catherine arrived the following week with homemade cookies and a genuine desire to understand what the centre needed. "How's little Emma today?" Catherine asked, immediately scanning the room for a shy 6-year-old who'd captured her heart months ago. Emma's mother had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and they'd been living in temporary accommodation for over a year. "She's in the art corner." Sarah pointed toward a sunny alcove where several children sat around a low table, their fingers covered in paint. "She's been working on something special all morning." Catherine made her way over, stopping briefly to admire a block tower built by twin boys whose father worked 3 jobs to keep their family housed, and to listen to a story being enthusiastically told by Amira, a 7-year-old whose family had arrived from Syria 2 years ago with limited English but unlimited determination. "Hello, Emma," Catherine said softly, crouching down beside the little girl's chair. "What are you creating today?" Emma looked up, her face breaking into a smile that transformed her usually serious expression. In her small hands was a painting, swirls of blue and green with yellow dots scattered across the paper like stars. "It's for you," Emma whispered, holding out the artwork with paint-stained fingers. "Sarah told us you like gardens, so I painted the sky above a garden. The yellow bits are not stars, they're wishes." Catherine felt her throat tighten as she accepted the gift. This wasn't the first piece of children's art that had found its way into her private collection, but each one affected her deeply. These weren't children creating art for a princess, they were children sharing their hearts with someone they'd come to trust. "It's absolutely beautiful," Catherine said, meaning every word. "Will you tell me about the wishes?" Emma's face grew thoughtful. "Well, there's one for my mummy to not be sad anymore, and one for us to have our own house with a garden, and one for you to keep visiting us because you make everyone happy when you come." The simplicity of the wishes, basic needs for security, happiness, and connection, struck Catherine profoundly. These were children whose entire worlds had been upended by circumstances beyond their control, yet they still found space in their hearts for hope and kindness towards others. "Your mummy is very lucky to have such a thoughtful daughter," Catherine said, carefully rolling up the painting. "And I'm lucky to have such talented friends here." As the morning progressed, Catherine moved naturally through the center's activities. She wasn't there as a patron or a figurehead making an appearance. She was there as a participant. She helped in the kitchen preparing snacks for the children and chatting with the mothers and fathers who volunteered their time despite their own struggles. She sat cross-legged on the floor during story time, occasionally being called upon to provide the voice of a character when the regular reader needed help with multiple parts. In the baby room, she held 6-month-old Marcus while his teenage mother, Jade, attended a literacy class in the next room. Marcus had been born premature, and his early months had been spent largely in hospital. Now, finally healthy enough to be out in the world, he needed extra attention and care that the center's volunteers provided while his mother worked to complete her education. "He loves you," observed Mrs. Joan. Patterson, an elderly volunteer who'd been with the center since it opened 15 years ago, babies always know when someone genuinely cares. Catherine looked down at Marcus, who had indeed settled completely in her arms, his tiny fist wrapped around her finger. "He's just content to be held," she said softly. "Sometimes that's all any of us really need." Patterson studied Catherine's face with the wisdom of someone who'd seen countless people come and go through the center's doors. "You know, dear, in all my years here, I've seen plenty of well-meaning people visit, politicians, local celebrities, business people. They come, they take their photos, they make their speeches, and they leave. But you come here for them, not for you. The children can feel the difference." The observation stayed with Catherine as she continued her visit. Was it really that simple? Had she stumbled onto something that other people in her position missed? The answer, she was beginning to realize, lay not in what she brought to these visits, but in what she received from them. During the center's communal lunch, a simple meal of soup and sandwiches shared by everyone present, Catherine found herself at a table with 3 mothers whose stories represented the complex web of challenges facing modern British families. Lisa, 24, had been made redundant from her job at a local supermarket and was struggling to find new employment while caring for her 2 young children. The centre provided childcare during her job interviews and had become her primary source of social support during a period of isolation and uncertainty. Maria, originally from Portugal, had moved to London with her husband 5 years ago in search of better opportunities. When her husband died suddenly in a construction accident, she found herself navigating grief, single parenthood, and a complex immigration system that threatened her right to remain in the country. The centre had connected her with legal aid services and provided emotional support during her darkest moments. Priya, a recent university graduate, had found herself homeless after aging out of the foster care system at 18. Despite having good qualifications, the lack of a permanent address made securing employment nearly impossible, creating a cycle she couldn't break without support. The centre provided not just practical assistance, but also hope that her situation was temporary. These women could have been anyone, neighbours, colleagues, friends. Their circumstances weren't the result of personal failures or poor choices, but rather the unfortunate intersection of life events and systemic challenges that could affect anyone. Listening to their stories, Catherine was struck by their resilience, their determination to provide better lives for their children, and their gratitude for the smallest gestures of support. "The thing is," Lisa was explaining as she helped her 3-year-old son with his sandwich, "before I found this place, I felt completely alone. When you're struggling, people don't know what to say to you. They either avoid you completely or they try to fix everything with advice that doesn't really apply to your situation. Here, nobody judges you, nobody makes you feel like your problems are your fault." Maria nodded in agreement. "When my husband died, I thought my world had ended. I didn't speak English very well, I didn't understand the systems here, and I had a baby to care for. Sarah didn't just help me with practical things, she helped me believe that I could survive this." Priya added, "What I love about this place is that they don't just give you help, they give you dignity. They make you feel like you have something to offer too. I help with the older children's homework now, and it reminds me that I have value even when everything else in my life feels uncertain." Catherine listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions, but mostly just being present for these women's truths. This was education that no royal briefing or policy paper could provide. Real understanding of how ordinary people experienced extraordinary challenges and how community support could make the difference between despair and hope. After lunch, while the children napped and the parents attended various workshops, Catherine sat with Sarah in the centre's small office, surrounded by filing cabinets, children's artwork, and the controlled chaos of an organization doing vital work on a shoestring budget. "How do you do it?" Catherine asked. "How do you see this level of need every day and not become overwhelmed by it?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering the question. You know, I think it would be overwhelming if we tried to solve everything at once. But we don't. We just focus on today, on the person in front of us, on the immediate need we can meet. We trust that if we do that consistently, day after day, it adds up to something meaningful. She gestured toward the window, where they could see children playing in the center's small outdoor space, a patch of concrete that had been transformed with colorful paint, garden planters, and playground equipment donated by local businesses. Take Emma, for instance. When she first came here with her mother, she wouldn't speak to anyone. She'd sit in the corner and watch everything with these huge, serious eyes. Her mother was so depressed she could barely get out of bed, let alone engage with her daughter. We couldn't fix their housing situation or erase the trauma they'd experienced, but we could provide a safe space for Emma to be a child and give her mother some hope that things could get better. Catherine remembered her first meeting with Emma, a silent little girl who seemed to carry the weight of adult worries in her small frame. The transformation she'd witnessed over the months of her visits was remarkable, but she was beginning to understand that it hadn't happened overnight or through any single intervention. Now Emma talks, she laughs, she makes friends, she creates art. Sarah continued. Her mother has started volunteering here, which has given her a sense of purpose and connection. They're still in temporary housing, but they're not just surviving anymore. They're building a life. This was the reality that Catherine was beginning to understand about effective community work. It wasn't about grand gestures or large donations, though those certainly helped. It was about consistent presence, genuine relationships, and the patient work of helping people rebuild their lives, one small step at a time. As the afternoon wound down, Catherine helped with the cleanup, stacking tiny chairs and wiping down tables while children gradually departed with their parents or caregivers. Each goodbye included promises to see each other the following week, plans for upcoming activities, and the kind of casual affection that develops between people who see each other regularly. Will you read us a story next time? Asked Thomas, a 5-year-old, whose confidence with English had grown dramatically since Catherine first met him. Of course, she replied, ruffling his hair. Do you have any requests? Something with dragons? Called out his sister Anna, bouncing with excitement at the prospect. Dragons it is, Catherine promised, making a mental note to find an appropriate storybook before her next visit. As she prepared to leave, Catherine reflected on how these visits had evolved over time. What had started as a desire to understand and help had become something much more reciprocal. She came to give support, but she left feeling enriched by the experience, educated about aspects of life that her privileged background had never exposed her to, and reminded of the fundamental human connections that transcend social class and circumstance. The car ride back to Kensington Palace was quiet, giving her time to process the day's experiences. Emma's painting sat carefully protected beside her, destined for a special place in her private study alongside dozens of other treasures created by the children she'd come to know and care about. These visits were beginning to shape not just her understanding of her role as a future queen, but her understanding of what it meant to be useful in the world. The traditional royal engagement, the ribbon cutting, the formal inspection, the carefully managed interaction had its place. But this felt different. This felt like life. 3 weeks later, Catherine found herself in a completely different setting, but with the same sense of purpose that had drawn her to the Children's Centre. The morning was crisp and clear as she walked through the entrance of St. Mary's Hospice, a peaceful building nestled between tall oak trees in the countryside outside Windsor. Unlike her visits to Safe Haven, these trips were even more private, known only to a handful of people who understood the deeply personal nature of the work being done here. The hospice specialized in care for terminally ill patients and their families, providing not just medical support, but emotional and spiritual guidance during life's most difficult transitions. Catherine had first learned about St. Mary's through her work with various charities, but her connection to this place had become something far more meaningful than professional obligation. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," greeted Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the hospice's chief medical officer, as Catherine entered the reception area. Despite Catherine's repeated requests to be called simply by her first name during these visits, Dr. Warren maintained a gentle formality that seemed to ease the interactions with patients who sometimes felt overwhelmed by the presence of royalty during such vulnerable times.
"How is everyone today?" Catherine asked, removing her coat and accepting the visitor's badge that would allow her to move freely through the facility.
She'd completed all the necessary training and background checks to volunteer here, something that had required careful coordination with palace security, but had been worth every complicated arrangement.
"We have a few familiar faces who'll be pleased to see you, Dr. Petua,"
Warren replied, leading Catherine down a corridor lined with photographs of the hospice's garden through different seasons. "And there's someone new I'd like you to meet, if you're comfortable with that. Her name is Margaret Thompson, and she's been asking about the volunteer who sounds like someone important but acts like a regular person." Catherine smiled at the description. One of the unexpected challenges of volunteering in such settings was navigating the reactions of people who recognized her. Some patients and families were eager to interact, viewing her presence as a bright spot during difficult times. Others found the attention overwhelming when they were dealing with profound grief and loss. She'd learned to follow the lead of the medical staff, who had an intuitive sense of what each person needed. The hospice was designed to feel as little like a medical facility as possible. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and large windows showcasing the beautiful grounds created an atmosphere of peace rather than clinical sterility. Catherine's first stop was always the communal living area, where patients who were well enough could spend time outside their rooms, participating in activities or simply enjoying company. She found Harold Peterson exactly where she'd expected, in his usual armchair by the window, working on a crossword puzzle, with the intense concentration of someone who'd made it his personal mission to complete every puzzle in the book before his time ran out. Harold was 83, a retired teacher who'd been diagnosed with advanced cancer 6 months earlier. His wife of 57 years visited every day, but in the quiet morning hours he often appreciated having someone to chat with about everything except his illness. "Ah, the puzzle expert returns," Harold said with a grin as Catherine approached. "I've got a real stumper for you today. 7 letters, noble bearing that doesn't require a title." This had become their ritual. Harold would save particularly challenging clues for Catherine's visits, and they'd work through them together while discussing books, current events, or memories from his decades in the classroom. It was exactly the kind of normal interaction that many patients craved during their time at the hospice.
"Noble bearing that doesn't require a title," Catherine repeated thoughtfully, settling into the chair beside Harold's.
"How many letters do we have so far?" "Just the D in the middle," Harold replied, showing her the puzzle grid. "It's been driving me mad all morning." They worked through possible answers, while Harold shared updates about his grandson's university studies and his concern about whether the young man was taking his coursework seriously enough. These conversations reminded Catherine that even in the face of terminal illness, people remained fundamentally themselves, worried about their families, interested in the world around them, eager to share their knowledge and experience. "Dignity!" Catherine exclaimed suddenly. "Noble bearing that doesn't require a title, it's dignity." Harold's face lit up as he carefully filled in the letters. "Brilliant. I knew you'd crack it. You have a gift for seeing the obvious answer that the rest of us miss, because we're thinking too hard." The comment struck Catherine as unexpectedly profound. In her royal role, she was often praised for her intelligence, her poise, her ability to handle complex situations with grace. But here, her value lay in something simpler: the capacity to be present, to listen, and to engage authentically with people who had no agenda beyond human connection. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Janet, one of the hospice's therapy dogs, accompanied by her handler, volunteer coordinator, Mary Sullivan. Janet was a golden retriever whose gentle temperament and intuitive understanding of human emotion made her perfect for this work. She made her rounds through the hospice daily, somehow always knowing which patients needed her presence most. "Janet's been asking about you," Mary said with a wink as the dog immediately approached Catherine for attention. "I think she remembers the treats you brought last time." Catherine laughed, scratching behind Janet's ears. "I may have spoiled her a bit, but how could I resist this face?" The presence of the therapy dog created an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. Other patients began gathering around, sharing stories about pets they'd loved, asking about Janet's training, and simply enjoying the uncomplicated joy that animals could provide. These moments of lightness were precious in a place where families grappled with profound loss, and Catherine had learned to recognize and nurture them whenever they arose. After spending time in the communal area, Catherine moved through the hospice's individual rooms, visiting patients who were less mobile but equally appreciative of company. Each visit was different. Some patients wanted to talk about their lives and memories, others preferred quiet companionship, and still others found comfort in practical assistance with small tasks. In room 12, she met Margaret Thompson, the woman Dr. Warren had mentioned earlier. Margaret was 78, a former librarian whose love of books was evident from the stack of novels on her bedside table. She'd been at the hospice for 3 weeks, adjusting to the reality that her ovarian cancer was no longer responding to treatment. "So you're the mysterious volunteer everyone's been talking about," Margaret said with a shrewd smile as Catherine entered her room.
I have to say, you're not quite what I expected.
Catherine settled into the bedside chair, curious about Margaret's perspective. What were you expecting? Well, Margaret said thoughtfully, when people describe someone who is clearly important but trying not to act like it, I imagined someone rather more pompous. But you seem perfectly normal, if you don't mind me saying so. I don't mind at all, Catherine replied honestly. Normal is exactly what I'm aiming for. This was the beginning of what would become one of Catherine's most meaningful relationships at the hospice. Margaret had spent her career helping people find the books they needed, the information they sought, the stories that would transport them to different worlds. Even facing her own mortality, she retained that same generous spirit, eager to understand the people around her and help them in whatever way she could. Tell me about yourself, Margaret said, adjusting her position in the hospital bed. Not the official version, the real version. What brings you to spend your time in a place like this? It was a direct question that Catherine had been asked in various forms by patients, their families, and even hospice staff. The honest answer was complex, rooted in her growing understanding of what it meant to use privilege responsibly and her deep need for authentic connection in a life that was often carefully managed and public. I think, Catherine said slowly, choosing her words carefully, I've learned that the most meaningful parts of life happen in quiet moments between people who genuinely care about each other. My public role involves a lot of ceremonial occasions and formal events, which certainly have their place. But here, I get to be useful in a more direct way. I get to listen to people's stories, help with small practical things, and hopefully provide some comfort during difficult times. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. You know, in my 40 years as a librarian, I met thousands of people. The ones I remembered weren't necessarily the most famous or successful. They were the ones who treated me like a real person, who were genuinely interested in what I had to offer. It sounds like you understand that principle. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret's daughter, Susan, who'd driven 2 hours from London to spend the day with her mother. Susan was a busy executive who'd taken leave from her job to help manage her mother's care, and the stress of the situation was evident in her tired eyes and worried expression. Mum, I've brought those photo albums you wanted, Susan said, placing several heavy books on the bedside table. And I spoke with the lawyer about updating your will as we discussed. Catherine began to excuse herself to give the family privacy, but Margaret gestured for her to stay. Susan, I'd like you to meet Catherine, one of the volunteers here. She's been keeping me company this morning. Susan looked at Catherine with the polite but distracted attention of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. That's lovely, Mum. Thank you for spending time with her, she said to Catherine before turning back to her mother. Now, about the house. I think we need to start going through your things soon so we can decide what to keep and what to donate. Catherine watched as Margaret's face fell slightly. The conversation, though necessary, was clearly painful. A reminder that her death would require the dismantling of a lifetime's worth of accumulated memories and possessions. Susan's practical approach was understandable, even admirable, but it wasn't addressing her mother's emotional needs in the moment. Mrs. Thompson, Catherine said gently, would you like to look through some of those photo albums now? I'd love to hear about the stories behind the pictures. Margaret's face brightened immediately, and Susan looked relieved to have someone else engage with her mother, while she made phone calls and handled the administrative aspects of end-of-life care. As they opened the first album, Margaret began sharing stories from her childhood, her marriage, her years as a young mother, and her career. Each photograph prompted detailed memories, and Catherine found herself drawn into a rich narrative of a life well lived. This was our first house, Margaret explained, pointing to a black and white photograph of a modest semi-detached home with a small front garden. We saved for 3 years to afford the down payment. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I planted roses in that front garden, and they bloomed every year for 25 years. As Margaret continued sharing her memories, Catherine noticed Susan gradually joining the conversation, adding her own recollections and asking questions about family history she'd never heard before. The photo album had transformed what could have been a purely administrative visit into an opportunity for connection and storytelling. I'd forgotten about your victory garden during the war, Susan said, studying a picture of a much younger Margaret standing proudly beside rows of vegetables. You never told me you won a prize for your turnips. Oh, that was quite the competition, Margaret laughed. Mrs. Henderson next door was convinced she'd win with her carrots, but my turnips were magnificent that year. The secret was talking to them every morning while I watered. These stories revealed Margaret not just as a patient with a terminal diagnosis, but as someone who'd lived through historical events, raised children, built a career, and contributed to her community in countless ways. Catherine realized this was one of the most valuable things she could offer during these visits, the time and attention to see people in their full humanity, not just as medical cases or charity recipients. After spending 2 hours with Margaret and Susan, Catherine moved on to other areas of the hospice. In the family consultation room, she sat with David Williams, whose wife of 42 years had passed away peacefully the night before. David wasn't ready to leave yet, not ready to face their empty house or begin the process of planning a funeral. He just needed to sit with someone who could tolerate his grief without trying to fix it or hurry him through it. "We met at a dance when we were 19, David told Catherine, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "I saw her across the room and thought she was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. Took me 3 songs to work up the courage to ask her to dance." Catherine listened as David shared memories of his marriage, their early years of financial struggle, the joy of raising 3 children, the challenges of caring for aging parents, and the quiet contentment of their retirement years. His grief was raw and overwhelming, but threaded through it was profound gratitude for the life they'd shared. "She never complained, not once during the whole illness," David continued. "Even at the end, she was more worried about how I was coping than about what she was going through. The nurses here, they helped her have dignity right until the last moment. I don't know how to thank them for that." There were no words that could ease David's pain, and Catherine had learned that trying to offer platitudes or false comfort often did more harm than good. Instead, she simply sat with him, occasionally asking gentle questions that allowed him to share more memories and ensuring he knew he wasn't alone during these first awful hours of his new reality. "Would you like me to help you call anyone?" she offered eventually. "Or I could sit with you while you make some calls yourself." "My daughter is driving up from Brighton," David replied. "She should be here in an hour. I couldn't bear the thought of going home to an empty house just yet." "Of course," Catherine said. "There's no rush at all. Take all the time you need." As the morning progressed, Catherine moved between different areas of the hospice, each presenting its own challenges and rewards. In the children's wing, the section she'd requested special training to visit, she met 8-year-old Lucy, who was receiving palliative care for a rare genetic condition. Lucy's room was filled with artwork from her classmates, stuffed animals, and a collection of audiobooks that helped pass the time when she was too tired for other activities. "Are you here to read to me?" Lucy asked hopefully as Catherine entered her room. "The other lady usually comes on Thursdays, but maybe you could read something too." Catherine settled beside Lucy's bed with a collection of picture books. "What kind of stories do you like best?" "Funny ones," Lucy replied without hesitation. "Sad stories make Mummy cry, and she's already sad enough about me being sick. So I only want to hear funny stories when she's here." The simple wisdom of this 8-year-old, her awareness of her mother's pain, and her determination to protect her from additional sadness was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Catherine chose a silly story about a dog who thought he was a cat, and Lucy giggled at all the right moments, occasionally adding her own commentary about the ridiculous situations the confused dog found himself in. "Do you have any pets?" Lucy asked when the story ended. "I do," Catherine replied. "I have a dog named Orla who's quite clever, but sometimes she does silly things too. Once she got into the kitchen garbage and emerged with an empty yogurt container stuck on her head. She wandered around, bumping into things until we rescued her." Lucy found this hilarious, and they spent several minutes trading stories about pets and their amusing behaviors. These moments of laughter and connection seemed to energize Lucy in a way that medical treatments couldn't, reminding Catherine of the healing power of joy and human connection. When it was time to leave the hospice, Catherine made her usual stop at the meditation garden, a quiet outdoor space where families and staff could find moments of peace away from the intensity of caring for dying patients. She often used this time to process her own emotions from the day's visits and to reflect on what she'd learned from each interaction. Sitting on a simple wooden bench surrounded by carefully tended flowers and herbs, Catherine thought about the profound privilege of being invited into people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. Each person she'd met today had taught her something different, about courage, about love, about the importance of dignity, about finding joy even in the darkest circumstances. Margaret had shown her how storytelling could transform a medical setting into a celebration of a life lived fully. David had demonstrated how grief, even at its most painful, could coexist with gratitude and love. Lucy had taught her that protecting others from our pain is sometimes an act of love, and that laughter truly can be medicine. These lessons were shaping not just Catherine's understanding of her role as a future queen, but her approach to living as a human being. The traditional royal education focused on protocol, history, and public service, but these visits were teaching her about service in its most fundamental form, showing up for people, listening to their stories, and offering whatever comfort and support was within her power to give. As she prepared to leave, Dr. Warren approached with a small update about Margaret Thompson. "I thought you'd like to know that Margaret's daughter mentioned how much their conversation this morning meant to both of them." Susan said it was the first time in weeks that her mother seemed like herself again, sharing stories and laughing. Sometimes, the most powerful medicine we can offer here is simply helping people remember who they are beyond their illness. Driving back toward Windsor, Catherine reflected on how these hospice visits had begun to influence her approach to her official royal duties as well. She found herself listening more carefully during public engagements, asking questions that went beyond the scripted pleasantries, and looking for ways to make genuine connections even within the constraints of formal protocol. The visits had also deepened her appreciation for the healthcare workers, social workers, volunteers, and caregivers who did this work every day. Their dedication, compassion, and professional skill created environments where people could face life's greatest challenges with dignity and support. Catherine was beginning to understand that her future role as queen would involve not just ceremonial duties, but also using her platform to advocate for and support the people who served others in such vital ways. But perhaps most importantly, these visits were teaching her that authentic leadership meant being willing to be present in difficult moments, to sit with pain and uncertainty, and to find ways to offer hope without minimizing the reality of people's struggles. These were lessons that no palace briefing could provide, wisdom that could only be gained through direct experience with people facing life's greatest challenges. On a particularly grey Thursday morning in November, Catherine made her way to a location that represented perhaps her most challenging and rewarding volunteer commitment, the Thames Valley Women's Refuge, a secure facility providing emergency accommodation and support services for women and children fleeing domestic violence. This visit required the highest level of discretion, as the safety of the residents depended on the location remaining confidential and secure. Catherine had been visiting the refuge for over 2 years, but the security arrangements still felt elaborate. Multiple checkpoints, coded entry systems, and careful coordination with the facility's own protection protocols. The residents here weren't just dealing with temporary hardship or medical challenges. They were rebuilding their lives after escaping situations where their safety had been threatened by the very people who were supposed to protect them. "Good morning, Kate," greeted Jenny Flores, the refuge's director, using the name by which Catherine was known to the residents. The decision to use her childhood nickname had been practical. It protected the residents' anonymity while allowing Catherine to blend in more naturally during group activities and informal interactions. "How is everyone doing this week?" Catherine asked, signing in at the reception desk and accepting the identification badge that would allow her to move freely through the secure areas of the building. "We have some challenging situations right now," Jenny replied as they walked down a corridor lined with children's artwork and motivational posters. 3 new families arrived this week, including one with teenage children who are struggling with the transition, and we're dealing with some complex legal issues for several of our long-term residents. The refuge housed up to 25 families at any given time, providing not just emergency accommodation but comprehensive support services, including counseling, legal advocacy, children's programs, and practical assistance with finding permanent housing and employment. Catherine had been amazed to learn about the complexity of issues that residents faced: immigration concerns, financial abuse, child custody battles, and the psychological trauma that often accompanied years of living in fear. Her first stop was the children's playroom, where a volunteer was leading a craft activity for 6 youngsters ranging in age from 4 to 10. These children had witnessed or experienced violence in their homes, and many struggled with anxiety, behavioral issues, and difficulty trusting adults. The refuge's children's program worked to provide stability, safety, and age-appropriate support, while their mothers focused on the legal and practical aspects of rebuilding their lives. "Miss Kate," called out 7-year-old Jamie, running over to show her a clay sculpture he'd been working on. "Look what I made. It's a house with a big garden and a fence to keep everyone safe." Catherine knelt down to examine Jamie's creation, noting the attention he'd paid to the protective barriers around his imaginary house. She'd learned that children from violent homes often expressed their need for safety through their artwork and play, and the refuge's staff were trained to recognize these signals and provide appropriate support. "That's a wonderful house, Jamie," she said seriously. "Tell me about the people who live there."
"It's for me and my mummy," Jamie explained.
"And maybe a dog, if dogs are allowed." The fence is really strong, so no bad people can get in, and there's a bell that rings if anyone tries to climb over. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jamie's mother, Sarah, who'd been meeting with the refugee's legal advocate about obtaining a restraining order against her abusive ex-partner. Sarah was 26, a former teaching assistant who'd left her job when her partner's controlling behavior made it impossible for her to maintain any independence. "How did the meeting go?" Catherine asked Sarah quietly, while Jamie returned to his craft project. "Complicated," Sarah replied with a tired sigh. "He's fighting the restraining order, claiming he's changed and wants to be involved in Jamie's life. My solicitor says it could take months to resolve, and until then, we're in legal limbo." This was one of the harsh realities Catherine had learned about domestic violence. Leaving an abusive relationship was often just the beginning of a long and complex process. Many residents faced ongoing legal battles, financial pressure from partners who'd controlled their access to money, and the constant stress of looking over their shoulders for someone who might still be seeking to harm them. "How is Jamie handling everything?" Catherine asked, watching as the little boy worked intently on adding windows to his clay house. "Better than I expected, honestly," Sarah replied. "The nightmares have mostly stopped, and he's starting to play again instead of just sitting quietly all the time. The children's counselor here is amazing. She's helped him understand that what happened wasn't his fault, and that it's okay to feel angry about it." Sarah's experience highlighted another aspect of domestic violence that Catherine had been educated about through her visits: the way children often blamed themselves for their parents' conflicts, and how witnessing violence could affect their development and ability to trust others. The Refuge's Children's Program addressed these issues through play therapy, counseling, and activities designed to help children process their experiences and build resilience. After spending time in the children's area, Catherine joined the weekly support group meeting, where residents could share their experiences, discuss challenges, and receive guidance from both professional staff and other women who'd been through similar situations. These meetings were facilitated by Dr. Amira Hassan, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, but much of the healing happened through peer support and shared experiences. Today's group included 8 women, ranging in age from 19 to 54, representing a diverse cross-section of backgrounds and circumstances. Catherine had been attending these sessions for over a year, and she'd witnessed remarkable transformations as women moved from crisis and fear to confidence and independence. "I want to start today by acknowledging some progress," Dr. Sagrik. Hassan began, settling into her chair in the circle of comfortable seating. "Lisa successfully completed her job interview this week and has been offered a position at the community college. And Maria received confirmation that her application for permanent housing has been approved." The group broke into spontaneous applause for these achievements, which might have seemed modest to outsiders, but represented enormous victories for women rebuilding their lives from scratch. Lisa had been working toward her teaching qualification when her abusive partner isolated her from her studies, and returning to education felt like reclaiming her identity. Maria had been living at the refuge for 8 months, while navigating both the housing system and immigration issues related to her abusive marriage. "How does it feel to have your own place lined up?" asked Teresa, a 43-year-old mother of 3 who'd been at the refuge for 6 months. "I can't even imagine having my own front door key again." Maria smiled, but Catherine could see the anxiety behind her happiness. "Exciting, but terrifying. I've gotten used to having people around all the time, having support available whenever I need it. The thought of being alone with the children again feels overwhelming." This was a common challenge that Catherine had observed. Women often felt conflicted about leaving the refuge, despite being eager for independence. After months or years of living in fear, the security and community of the refuge could feel like the only safe space they'd ever known.
"That's completely normal. Dr. Fade Out,"
Hassan assured Maria. "Independence after trauma doesn't mean you have to be alone. We'll continue working together, and you'll have ongoing support from our outreach program. Plus, you've built relationships here that don't have to end when you move out." The session continued with women sharing updates about their legal proceedings, job searches, and children's adjustments to life at the refuge. Catherine listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or offering encouragement, but mostly just being present as witness to these women's courage and determination. One topic that arose frequently was the challenge of dating and relationships after leaving abusive situations. Several women expressed concern about their ability to trust their judgment about potential partners, and others worried about how to explain their circumstances to people they met. "I keep wondering if what happened was somehow my fault," admitted Rebecca, a 32-year-old nurse who'd left her marriage after her husband's violence escalated to the point where she feared for her life. Maybe if I'd been stronger, or smarter, or handled things differently.
Stop right there, interrupted Carmen, a 50-year-old grandmother who'd become an informal mentor to newer residents. I spent 20 years thinking the same thing, making excuses for him, believing I could change him if I just tried harder.
The only thing I regret now is not leaving sooner. Carmen had been one of Catherine's first connections at the refuge, a woman whose wisdom and strength had been developed through hard experience. Her husband's abuse had begun subtly, criticism disguised as concern, isolation presented as protection, control framed as love. By the time the physical violence began, Carmen had been so psychologically manipulated that she believed she deserved it. The thing is, Carmen continued, these men are experts at finding women who are caring and forgiving and willing to see the best in people. Those aren't character flaws, those are beautiful qualities that were exploited by someone who chose to hurt you instead of cherish you. Catherine was continually struck by the insight and compassion these women showed for each other. Their shared experiences created a bond that transcended differences in age, background, or education, and their willingness to support each other was both inspiring and humbling. After the group session, Catherine spent time in individual conversations with several residents. In the refuge's small library, a quiet space donated by a local bookstore, she sat with 19-year-old Zara, who'd fled an arranged marriage where she'd been subjected to physical and emotional abuse by both her husband and his family. My parents keep calling, saying I've brought shame on the family, Zara explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. They want me to go back, to try harder to make the marriage work. They say divorce will ruin my younger sister's chances of finding a good husband. Zara's situation was particularly complex, involving cultural pressures in addition to the trauma of abuse. Catherine had learned through her visits that domestic violence affected women across all communities, but that cultural factors could create additional barriers to seeking help and leaving dangerous situations. What do you want to do? Catherine asked gently. Not what your parents want, not what anyone else expects. What feels right for you? I want to finish university, Zara replied without hesitation. I had 1 year left when I got married, and I want to complete my degree in social work. I want to help other young women who are in situations like mine. But my parents have stopped paying my tuition, and I don't know how I can manage financially. This conversation led to Catherine learning about the refuge's educational support program, which helped residents pursue training in education while addressing their immediate safety needs. The program had been successful in helping women develop skills and qualifications that led to economic independence, breaking the cycle of dependence that often trapped them in abusive relationships.
There are options, Catherine assured Zara.
Jenny can connect you with educational grants specifically designed for women in your situation, and there are part-time work programs that might help with expenses while you finish your studies. As Zara's face brightened with hope, Catherine reflected on how these conversations had expanded her understanding of the connections between different social issues. Domestic violence wasn't just about individual relationships. It was interconnected with poverty, immigration status, educational access, and cultural expectations. Effective support required addressing all these factors together. Later in the morning, Catherine joined a practical life skills workshop where residents learned about financial management, rental agreements, and other aspects of independent living. Many of the women had been financially controlled by their abusers and lacked experience with banking, budgeting, or understanding their legal rights as tenants. The workshop was led by Sandra Mitchell, a former refuge resident who'd completed training as a financial counselor and now worked with the organization as both staff member and role model. Sandra's journey from crisis to stability to professional success demonstrated to current residents that recovery was not only possible, but could lead to meaningful careers helping others. When I first came here, I didn't even know how to open a bank account, Sandra shared with the group. My ex-husband had convinced me I was too stupid to handle money, and I believed him. Learning these skills wasn't just about practical independence, it was about discovering that I was capable of taking care of myself. The workshop covered topics like understanding credit reports, comparing rental properties, and recognizing financial abuse tactics that could recur in future relationships. Catherine participated alongside the residents, asking questions and practicing role-playing exercises designed to build confidence in these essential life skills. One exercise involved negotiating with potential landlords who might discriminate against single mothers or women without long employment histories. Catherine watched as residents practiced advocating for themselves, presenting their situations positively while being honest about their circumstances. The growth in confidence she witnessed over the course of these workshops was remarkable. During the lunch break, Catherine helped in the refuge's communal kitchen, preparing meals alongside residents and volunteers. This shared domestic work created natural opportunities for informal conversation and relationship building, and Catherine had learned that some of her most meaningful connections with residents developed during these casual interactions. "You know what I miss most?" said Priya, a 40-year-old mother of two who was chopping vegetables for a curry. "Cooking for people I love, without having to worry about whether they'll criticize everything I do. My husband used to find fault with every meal I made, every ingredient I chose. Now when I cook here, people actually thank me and ask for the recipe." These small revelations about the daily reality of living with abuse helped Catherine understand the pervasive nature of the control and criticism that residents had endured. Rebuilding confidence wasn't just about major life decisions. It was about reclaiming joy in simple activities like cooking, choosing clothes, or expressing opinions without fear of punishment. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine attended a training session for volunteers, where she learned about new research on trauma-informed care and best practices for supporting survivors of domestic violence. These educational components of her visits ensured that her volunteer work was informed by current understanding of what approaches were most helpful and what might inadvertently cause additional harm. The training covered topics like recognizing signs of trauma responses, understanding why survivors might return to abusive relationships multiple times before leaving permanently, and learning how to offer support without judgment or pressure. Catherine had initially been surprised to learn how complex and non-linear the process of leaving abuse could be, but she'd come to understand that safety planning and recovery required careful consideration of multiple factors. "One of the biggest barriers to effective support," explained the trainer, "is when well-meaning people become frustrated with survivors who don't make the choices that seem obvious from the outside. Recovery happens at the survivor's pace, not ours, and our job is to provide consistent support regardless of how many attempts it takes." This lesson had particular relevance for Catherine, as she considered how to use her public platform to raise awareness about domestic violence. The traditional royal approach of highlighting issues through formal speeches and charity patronages had value, but her direct experience at the refuge was teaching her about the importance of nuanced understanding and long-term commitment rather than simple solutions. As her visit to the refuge concluded, Catherine participated in the weekly house meeting where residents discussed community guidelines, upcoming activities, and any concerns about daily life at the facility. These meetings gave residents a voice in how their temporary home was operated and helped maintain the sense of community that was crucial for healing and mutual support. "I wanted to suggest that we start a small garden in the courtyard space," proposed Janet, a resident who'd been a keen gardener before her life was disrupted by violence. "Working with plants is therapeutic, and it would give us fresh herbs for cooking. Plus, it might be a nice activity for the children." The idea was enthusiastically received, with several residents volunteering to research plant varieties suitable for container gardening and others offering to help with the physical work of setting up the space. Catherine volunteered to help source supplies and coordinate with local garden centers that might be willing to donate materials for the project. Watching this planning process, Catherine was struck by how important it was for residents to have opportunities to contribute positively to their community, not just receive support. The garden project would allow women to share their skills, create something beautiful together, and give back to the place that was helping them rebuild their lives. As she prepared to leave the refuge, Catherine reflected on how these visits had fundamentally changed her understanding of resilience, courage, and the complexity of social problems. Each woman she'd met had shown extraordinary strength in leaving dangerous situations and working to create better lives for themselves and their children, often in the face of ongoing threats and multiple barriers to independence. The refuge's work demonstrated the importance of comprehensive, long-term support that addressed not just immediate safety needs but also the practical, emotional, and legal challenges that survivors faced. Catherine had learned that effective services required coordination between multiple agencies, specialized training for staff and volunteers, and sustained funding that allowed programs to build trust and achieve lasting change. Perhaps most importantly, her experiences at the refuge had taught her about the power of believing in people's capacity to heal and thrive, even after experiencing the worst kinds of betrayal and violence. The transformation she'd witnessed in residents over time, from fear to confidence, from isolation to community, from survival to growth, reinforced her conviction that with proper support, people could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. Driving away from the refuge, Catherine considered how this work was shaping her preparation for future royal responsibilities. The traditional model of royal charity work often involved ceremonial appearances and fundraising events, which certainly had value. But her experiences at the Children's Centre, the hospice, and the Women's Refuge had shown her that the most meaningful service often happened quietly, consistently, and in direct relationship with people facing challenges. These visits were teaching her that effective leadership required deep understanding of the issues she sought to address, genuine relationships with people affected by those issues, and long-term commitment that extended beyond public attention or popular trends. The lessons she was learning about listening, presence, and authentic connection would serve her well regardless of the formal roles she might hold in the future. But beyond their value as preparation for public service, these visits had become an essential part of Catherine's own growth and understanding of the world. They challenged her assumptions, expanded her empathy, and reminded her daily of both the fragility and resilience of human life. In trying to serve others, she was discovering aspects of herself she hadn't known existed and developing capabilities she hadn't realized she possessed. As she returned to the formality and privilege of royal life, Catherine carried with her the voices, stories, and faces of the people she'd met. Emma's painting was carefully framed in her private study, alongside thank you cards from hospice families and photographs from refuge community events. These tangible reminders of her private volunteer work served as anchors, keeping her connected to the real impact of service and the genuine relationships that had become central to her understanding of her purpose in the world. The secret visits would continue, not because they were required by protocol or expected by the public, but because they had become essential to who Catherine was becoming. Not just as a future queen, but as a human being committed to using whatever opportunities and privileges she possessed in service of others' well-being and dignity.